All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are so excited for our Food for Thought. Today, we are glad to welcome Sue Adler and Ryan Arve from the Historic Savannah Foundation. And they're going to be telling us a little bit about what they do there and what they're doing for our city. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'll just say welcome to everyone. I always love coming to Food for Thought, so I'm happy to be here. I'm going to let Ryan really talk mostly, but I just want to tell you, May is Historic Preservation Month, and we usually have live events this month, throughout the month, but obviously we can't do that because of the virus. So we have gone virtual this month. So I invite you to go on our website. There's activities for children. So if your grandkids are around and you need some activities for them, there's a wonderful virtual scavenger hunt that we have on our website and other things as well. A drawing contest this entire month. And we'll pick the winner in June. We have Ryan's doing some other lectures and talks, and we have lots of information that we're sharing with the community on social media, because we feel it's really important to still talk about our history and our beautiful city. So Ryan is our Director of Historic Preservation and Historic Properties, and he manages our entire revolving fund, and I'll let him tell you about that. And while he talks, he'll also be able to be sharing with you a history of Historic Savannah Foundation, which was, by the way, founded by 7 ladies. But I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to do the presentation. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Sue. Audio okay? Everyone can hear me all right? Okay.
Yep.
Great. And just to double check, how long do we have for the presentation? Because I can stretch it as long as it needs to go, but just in general.
I say 30 minutes, an hour. It's really up to how long.
Okay, it's usually around 25 minutes. So
perfect. Yeah.
All right. Very good. As Sue said, I'm Ryan Arve.
Sorry. We've gotten a question as to what the website is for the Preservation Society. That way people can share it with their grandkids, or I may make my kids go do some virtual learning about Savannah. So
sure. The website is myhsf.org. That's my, H is in historic, S is in Savannah, F is in foundation.org. And when you get to the website, you'll see a big banner. It says Preservation Month. You can click on that, and that'll take you to the online kids activities and the other things that we have going this month, which culminates at the end of the month with a virtual tour of the Davenport House, which I'll be telling you a little bit about that property, which was the first one that the foundation saved. Just like all house museums in Savannah right now, Davenport House has been closed for about close to 2 months, and we are offering a free virtual tour. So you can explore from the basement to the attic that property starting on May 29th. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody, and you tell me if it works. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
All right, you got visuals? All right. So what I'm primarily going to be discussing with you today is how HSF uses our revolving fund to continue to save historic structures in Savannah. Whether you're an ardent fan of history and architecture or not, there is some aspect of Savannah that I know that you love, and good chance that that's going to have some historical aspect to it, whether it's the parks or the squares or the architecture or even just the plan of the city itself. And HSF, it is our mission to save all of those things. And we use the revolving fund as our primary tool to do that. So just a little quick history about HSF and the revolving fund. By the way, the gentleman that you see there in that old newspaper article, that is our first executive director, Reed Williamson. taken in 1968. He's there in front of a building on Bay Street, which the organization purchased and saved. And you'll notice that kind of hand-painted sign under his arm. About 3 years ago, I was in a vacant building, holes in the roof, plaster falling down, and it was full of stuff. No one had lived in it for at least a good 10 years. And amongst the various items that we were going through, we found this sign. Maybe not the exact same sign, but an identical sign to the ones that we used to use back in the 60s. And so I took it as a literal and figurative sign that we were doing the right thing in purchasing that property. But as I said, Reed was our first executive director, and he really is the one that's responsible for expanding the revolving fund into what it is today. There may be some amongst us here in the group that are longtime Savanians. You may know some of this history, you may not. But back in the 1950s, right, this is pretty much what Savannah looked like. It was not the polished gem that she is today. Even in the Landmark District, this was the general state of things. Lots of vacancy, rundown buildings, broken windows, overgrown tree lawns, right? Weeds growing up against the buildings. Very few of the original residents stayed downtown, and there was little to no tourism. These properties today are $1 million townhomes, but back then they were awaiting the wrecking ball. Back then, actually, demolition of historic structures was actually incentivized. A developer could come along and purchase a building such as this one and salvage it for the Savannah grade brick, which were very coveted, and then sell pallets of those bricks to the people building the homes down in the suburbs south of Duren, you know, back in the 50s and the 60s when those neighborhoods were being developed. And they could get more money for the materials than they could for the building. So it was lucrative for developers to tear buildings down. Of course, this all culminated in 1954 when the old city market was demolished on Ellis Square, kind of a grand Victorian market that replaced earlier 19th century structures. And of course, it was replaced with a parking lot. You know, that's what it seems like everything's replaced with. And just 1 year later, the Davenport House, built in 1820, was threatened with demolition. Once again, for what else? A parking lot. And actually, we're really fortunate that in this particular case, Anna Colquitt Hunter, who was a journalist, she was a writer, she was an artist. She found out about this, and she gathered together 6 of her friends, all of them influential in their own circles, and they formed the Historic Savannah Foundation. And their primary goal in forming the foundation was to save that house. So they were able to purchase it and stop the demolition. And it initially was our headquarters, and then eventually became a house museum, which it remains to this day, one of Savannah's premier house museums. If you've never visited, I highly recommend it. So just a really quick rundown of events. We started in 1955 to save one house, but by 1959, we were already looking at purchasing another one. Here on your screen, you see Marshall Row, located at Oglethorpe and Lincoln, I think it is. This property was one of those that had been purchased by a developer specifically for the bricks. This row of buildings actually once had carriage houses behind them. The carriage houses were actually demolished. Those bricks were sold off. But HSF was able to convene and purchase the building from the developer. Now, back then, our little organization didn't have any money. So individual members are the ones that put their name on the mortgage, right? They put their own necks on the line. If this project had excuse me, not been fruitful, it would have been them that was responsible. HSF may have been on the deed, but individuals were the ones that were actually helping to purchase these properties. And they said at the time, profit is not the aim of the investment. They were strictly trying to save the building from demolition. But they did restore it, and they did find tenants to buy each unit, and it was profitable, thereby showing and proving to people that real estate was a viable means of restoring and saving old buildings. You can't turn every old building into a house museum. They have to have some active use. People like Lee and Emma Adler, and Walter Hartridge, and early members of the organization proved that. We didn't actually start formally raising money for the revolving fund until 1964. We had done a couple projects using that old model, and they finally said, you know, we've got to relieve some of these individual members of the pressure. Let's do some real fundraising. They raised $200,000 back in 1964. And just to show you how depressed the real estate market was back in the 50s and 60s, how low the values were, they purchased 54 properties in 18 months for $200,000. Now, even adjusting for inflation, that's a little over $2 million today. You still couldn't buy 54 properties for $2 million back then, or today. So we purchased whole neighborhoods, whole blocks. In 1966, the National Landmark District was formed. And in 1967, we saved multiple buildings around Monterey Square, one of Savannah's most picturesque squares, including the Mercer Williams house. And you wonder to yourself, how could that have ever been endangered? Well, Armstrong College, which used to be in the old Armstrong Mansion there at the north end of Forsyth Park, they wanted to expand, and they owned all the property around the Armstrong Mansion. And their plan initially was to demolish Monterey Square and all the buildings around it and build some large mid-century buildings for classroom use. And we're very fortunate that Mills B. Lane, one of the founders of CNC Bank, and a preservationist at heart, he came to the college and he said, you know, I've got this property south of town. It's about 300 acres. I'm willing to donate it to you for a proper campus if you will agree to sell all your property holdings around Monterey Square to the Historic Savannah Foundation. So the organization was able to get those properties, and then we were able to turn around and sell them to preservation-minded buyers like Jim Williams, who purchased the Mercer House from us. And we put easements on those, which then protected them in perpetuity. In 1968, we published our first survey of historic buildings, the first of its kind in Savannah. But even with all these early initial successes in our first decade, we did witness some losses. And one of the biggest was probably the demolition of this building, the lower left of your screen. That is the old Union Station, which used to be on Martin Luther King Boulevard, then West Broad Street. That beautiful Beaux-Arts building was demolished when they built I-16. Today, there's a flyover that goes over MLK down onto Montgomery. Right where the flyover is where that train station used to be. And maybe even more tragic than the loss of the train station. You see the newspaper article there on your screen. You see that kind of triangular shape with all those buildings in it. Those are the current housing projects that are there today. That was an entire neighborhood of historic buildings, most of them African-American dwellings, for people who worked at the railroad station and the Central of Georgia Rail Yard. So an entire neighborhood was erased under the guise of urban renewal. And you see the headline there, urban renewal, not waste, says mayor. Unfortunately, it was. So in that time, we have saved to date over 400 historic structures using our revolving fund and our easements program. And everybody loves before and after pictures. So I'm going to treat you right now to a little candy and show you a little bit about the process, how we save historic buildings, and the fruits of some of that labor. So here on your screen, you see all the historic districts in Savannah. Actually, they've added some since this map was created. We work in the 4 main historic districts, mostly the National District or Downtown, Victorian, Thomas Square, and Cuyler Brownville, as well as East Side. And these are just the buildings here that we've done in the downtown area since the organization was founded. And our criteria for buying buildings is simple. Number 1, is it vacant? We don't want to displace people, right? So number 1, we're looking for houses that have been unoccupied, sometimes 5, 10, even 15 years. One that we're looking at now has been empty for 20 years. Is it endangered? What that means is, does it suffer from long-term neglect or imminent demolition? And is it in our target area? Right? So we are working mostly in areas like Thomas Square and Cuyler Brownville because those are the areas that would benefit the most from our investment. The downtown and the Landmark District, we love to save buildings down there, but frankly, it's been pretty well taken care of, pretty well developed. A lot of buildings have been restored. It's so darn expensive. Those properties are probably going to take care of themselves. We're looking in the neighborhoods that need a little bit more help. And the process is simple. We start at the top there at our 12 o'clock position, and we purchase a vacant endangered historic building. We use money that has been privately raised. We don't receive any public money. We're not supplemented by city or county government. It's all private donations and grants. And we buy the building. We buy the building because it gives us a certain amount of control over what happens to it. We clean it up. We stabilize it if necessary, maybe make minor repairs. And then we look for a preservation-minded buyer because it's the buyer who's going to actually carry out the restoration of the building. The reason we do that is because it's different to spend a little bit of money and purchase a building and then find a buyer. If we were to buy a building and then spend $250,000, $300,000 to restore it ourselves, before we sell it, we are tying up a lot more money for 12 to 18 months. And it's important that we keep that money on the streets, buying properties in order to protect them. So for the most part, we find willing, interested, qualified, preservation-minded buyers to buy it from us with an easement, and then they're the ones that carry out the restoration work. And the money from the sale goes back into buying another property, and thus it revolves. And that same money is at work all the time. This is a criteria sheet that we use to kind of rate each property. So I promised you some before and after pictures. So this is a picture from the 1960s of Charlton Row, right off of Troop Square. Most of it was vacant, windows broken out. You can see all the original stoops were replaced with metal, kind of fire escape looking staircases. And when we were done with it, it's been transformed into one of a premier row of housing there. The Catherine Ward House, which is in the Victorian District on Waldberg Street, was a great old Italianate building, empty for years, and is now a very successful bed and breakfast. The 500 block of East Jones Street is part of the Beach Institute neighborhood and largely developed by African Americans after the Civil War. So a little bit different in character than the rest of Jones Street, which is largely brick and masonry. It's all wood framed houses. And in the 1990s, there were 9 properties on this block the city slated for demolition. So HSF bought each one of them and was able to restore them. This is traditionally how we find houses. The porch has been removed. It's boarded up. That's a double house. This one, you see all that framing on the outside. That's because the entire porch had been enclosed at one point. And we were able to remove all of that and restore the porches. This one not only was vacant for years, but a car drove through the left-hand side of it. You see where that tarp is. A vehicle took out the entire porch and drove right into it. And it was slated for demolition by the city, and we were able to save it. And it's a very simple little building, but what a difference. This was a large multi-family building. This is actually one that we did from A to Z using some money from the National Trust as well as HGTV. And it now has about 5 units in it. This large Victorian house was catty corner to that last property. That we considered this part of our Lincoln Street initiative. This house belonged to a cousin of legendary Savannah author Flannery O'Connor. This is the P.J. O'Connor house. And we purchased this one and sold it to a SCAD professor of preservation, Jim Abraham. And this is an instance in which we sold it to, we didn't sell to the highest bidder. We never are very concerned with who the highest bidder is. We're looking at who is going to be the best steward for the property. So Jim was the middle bidder on this property. There was someone who was bidding higher, but the higher bidder wanted to turn it into SCAD apartments. And Jim wanted to turn it back into a single family home. And we are always more interested in single family homes, owner-occupied buyers, because Jim was going to live in the house. And if you're an owner-occupied buyer, you're going to put more into it, probably take better care of it, finer finishes. So yeah, we walked away from some extra cash, but we're always going to put our mission above the bottom line. And so you can see we made the correct decision. A meticulous, thorough restoration. It was really a labor of love for Jim. And one of the biggest things that he did was, you'll notice that front porch that's on it is totally different than what Jim. So we actually were donated a tiny 2-inch by 2-inch photograph by P.J. O'Connor's granddaughter of them standing in front of the house. So we had a picture of what the original porch looked like. And so Jim reconstructed it based on that photograph. This is a more recent project. This is the Berrien House at the corner of Broughton and Habersham. It was a 18th century house. It was one of the last unrestored 18th century homes in downtown Savannah. The bottom floor had been raised and made into a storefront. The staircase had been removed from the front. They had stuccoed over the original wood siding, and the wall, the western wall, was collapsing. And the city wanted to tear it down because the owner would not put any money into it. We had an easement on it, which is a legal deed restriction. Our easements basically grant HSF the right to oversee and approve design changes to the exterior of the building. And so we came in as per the easement, and we reinforced and stabilized that western wall. Cost us about $50,000 to do it. Now, the owner wasn't going to pay that, so we put a lien on the property. Now, a couple years later, a buyer comes along and wanted to purchase the property. He was actually a descendant of John Berrien, the original builder from 1798. He was a descendant of his, wanted to buy the house, but he didn't want to have to pay an extra $50,000 to do it. Someone needed to satisfy the lien. And so HSF forgave the lien. We basically just said, hey, we don't want to stand in the way of someone like you purchasing the property. We will go ahead and just, forgive it, which we did, because again, the mission is the most important. That's the priority. And you can see the wonderful job he did. We awarded him a preservation award for the exterior of this. They lowered the building. They didn't just completely redo it. They actually lowered the building back to its original height, rebuilt the double stairs, uncovered the wood siding, and the inside is even more amazing. He's continued to work on that up until recently, restoring it to its original floor plan. This is another property that the city wanted to tear down over in the East Side neighborhood. A very unusual, eccentric building that was close to demolition, and we purchased it. We purchased it at the height of the market in 2008. So you guys are all muted, but I'm sure there has to have been at least one or two, ooh, you know, I can't hear you, but that's usually everyone's reaction, because as soon as we bought this property, the housing market tanked, and we were left holding it for about 5 years when a young couple came along and wanted to buy it. Of course, values were still greatly depressed, and we sold it at a considerable loss. Once again, putting our mission first, because we knew that this couple was the right couple to restore the home. They wanted to live in it, and it was the right thing to do, even though we did lose quite a bit of money on this one. But it's an amazing transformation, and he's done a fantastic job. This property, we actually never purchased this property. This is a property HSF saved twice. The first time we reinforced the porch. This house had a fire in it, and it was vacant for a couple decades. And the porch was collapsing. So of course the city wanted to tear the whole thing down. So we came in, reinforced the porch. And then a couple years later, a young couple purchased it. And they went to the bank, and because they were a young couple and first-time homeowners, and because it was an old house, the banks are generally a little nervous about lending money. So they usually require a loan guarantee. They require extra money down as a guarantee on the loan. And this young couple just didn't have any extra money to put up. So HSF instituted what we call our loan guarantee. It's a $50,000 loan guarantee at Queensboro National Bank. And that money is used to guarantee the loan, so that if there was any kind of a default, they could draw on that guarantee. Fortunately, that's never happened. Every time that they've utilized it, it's been there as a security. And as soon as the house is finished, the bank reappraises it, and construction loan turns into a regular mortgage, and we get our money back and we go use it on another property. So they did a fantastic job on this, and we continue to use that loan guarantee to this day. So I want to go over a few recent projects as we conclude, just to kind of show you what we're working on now, and I'll again kind of pull back the curtain a little bit on how we work. So as an example, we're going to use this 1913 duplex. Built in 1913. You can see there on your screen, it's right across the street from Anderson Hall, the SCAD building, at the corner of Anderson and Price Street. It was built as a duplex. Very simple. I think the first tenants in this house were a clerk and a fireman, and their respective spouses, one upstairs, one downstairs. And this is generally how we find properties when I first come across them. So I wish that every property was like this. So a lady called us up from Atlanta and said, my aunt has passed away, where we want to sell the house. Is HSF interested? That doesn't happen often enough, but in this case, they came to us. Usually I'm going around, knocking on doors. In this case, the door was wide open. Someone had broken into it. So I told her, and she's like, okay, well, if you feel safe, just go in. I don't care. You can go check it out. So I went in, and in this particular case, it looked like, Art Bunker had just stepped out to get some coffee. It was trapped in the 70s and fairly well furnished. The family wanted none of this. As you can see, someone had been in there, kind of ransacked it. So when we actually purchased it, we purchased it with everything inside. So we always hold a volunteer cleanup with every property. A good group of volunteers that come through. We do everything from remove old carpet to expose the hardwood floors. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen, we pulled back a couple layers of linoleum to reveal a 1920s newspaper, which they oftentimes would put under the vinyl. It was fused to the floor. Had become part of the floor. And we always do a set of drawings. And the reason we do a set of drawings is because we want any potential buyers to know from the beginning what we are expecting. We do all our research to make sure the design is historically accurate. And we sell the property with this drawing kind of attached to the project. We don't want any surprises. We don't want anyone to, after the fact, oh, well, I didn't know I couldn't do this or that. So we always produce those drawings. This isn't a great after photo, but you can see the difference. They replaced, almost rebuilt the entire porch system, and whole new metal shingle roof, and a lot of work cleaning up all of these apartments. Then the other project I'll tell you about, that's a recent project that illustrates the benefit of HSF buying these houses. This is 625 East Broad. It's an old Victorian duplex. So there's 2 doors on this little building. It doesn't look like much, right? It looks almost kind of like an old trailer with a porch stuck on it. It's very nondescript, but that is kind of obscuring the very decorative details that used to be on this building. So one of the things HSF, I give us credit for, is we see the potential in these buildings that might be overlooked. And we also do something else beneficial. HSF does not buy properties that are on the market. We strictly go after properties that are vacant and have been vacant for many years. And there's usually a reason that they're vacant. Is because someone has passed away and the family has not probated it. Maybe they don't have the resources to get an attorney, and they're stuck. The buildings are stuck. They can't be sold. So what we do is we help shake them loose. Houses that are currently listed on the market, that's low-hanging fruit to us. We like to climb up to the top of the tree, shake the tree, shake the fruit loose at the top that no one else can reach. And this is one of those properties. So when I first came upon this property, I didn't know if it was vacant or not. I figured it was. Mail was overflowing out of the mailbox, and I'd been watching it for a year or two. And when I went up to it, I knocked on the door to see if anyone answered, and the door, creaked open. It was unlocked, and this is what was inside. Someone had been living in the house, squatting in the house, and there was evidence of that. I'll leave it at that. You can use your imagination. This was the other unit next door. So what do you do? What do you do in this case? Well, you don't go in, close the door, and we had to find the owner. Now, the owner was listed as a Pearl Jackson, and Miss Jackson, I found out by Googling her name, found her obituary. She had passed away. Not surprising, but the obituary did list her daughter. And so we found her daughter and got in contact with her, and she said we could look at the house. Now, she would not come in with us. She was so sad at the current state of the house, and so remorseful that she had not been able to keep it up. But I went through the house, photographed it, and we were able to enter into an agreement with her to buy the house. She had been pressured by the next door neighbor who offered to pay $10,000 more than anyone else to buy the house because he wanted to demolish it and put a drive-through through to the parking lot behind the house. Excuse me. And then the city came along and the city condemned it. So she knew that the house didn't have many more days left. So she agreed to sell to us. And that was great. Unfortunately, when we got into the process of closing on the property, because we had to probate it, remember, it's still in the mother's name, we found out that Miss Hall here was not Miss Jackson's biological daughter. And that's a problem when it comes to probate law, because probate states that there's a certain sequence in which the heirs are prioritized, right? So, you know, spouse, children, siblings, children of siblings, of which Miss Jackson was none of the above. But Miss Jackson had raised her since the age of 6. She was, by all intents and purposes, Miss Jackson's daughter, and she had been the one who cared for Miss Jackson in her old age and tried her best to keep the taxes current on the property. She really should rightfully have been the one to inherit the house or any proceeds. So what we did is, there is an obscure probate law called virtual adoption, where if you can prove through a series of affidavits that an individual was raised by a certain person, the judge in some cases will rule favorably and recognize them as the child. Miss Jackson had no other children. She never married. And so that's the course we pursued, and the judge did recognize her as Miss Jackson's daughter, and we were able to sell the house. She was able to sell to us, and she received the proceeds from it. And the last time I was there at the house with her, she said, I'm so glad you guys got it. She said, now I can drive by the house and not be sad anymore. And so we immediately hired ServPro to clean the house out. No volunteer cleanup on this one. The carpets were soggy. There was mold. There was drug paraphernalia. Not a safe situation for volunteers. And so ServPro came in, cleaned out the house. Still very rough. You can see the light coming in through the rear kitchen. That's because there's a big hole in the roof. But we were able to clear it enough that we were able to bring people through, and we did an open house. And they could really see the potential, this wainscoting and the mantles. And you see that weird angle there? That's not a camera trick. That's how unsettled this house was. This is an old picture that we had in our filing cabinet of the house. I so wish that was Miss Hall on the porch. Unfortunately, it's not. It's one of her cousins. But I thought, oh, that would have been great if that had been her. It was taken back in the early 70s. And there's a twin house next door that's actually been fairly well cared for. So we did our research, we did our drawings, and you see this beautiful Victorian cottage. And we sold the property to a gentleman who's going to live in the entire property. He's keeping both doors, so the exterior maintains its original appearance. But he's nearly done, and I don't have an after photo for you because he's done everything on the property except the porch, which is the most impressive part. And he's dismantled it, and they're installing new porch posts like as we speak. So if you follow us on social media, keep your eyes out, because we will be featuring this property hopefully in the next month or so as he completes his renovation. I want to leave time for questions. So I'll do one more recent property, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. This is a house on Bolton Street. And when we first came upon it, you can see the front porches were falling off. You can see it's been very poorly braced. And before we could even close on it, the city forced the previous owner to remove the porches, which was fine because we figured they weren't original anyways. That was all dimensional lumber and plywood and Home Depot porch posts. So what we ended up buying was what you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And the question becomes, without photographs, what did it look like? We don't have a clue what the original porch looked like. Pardon me. on the left-hand side of your screen, you see what's called a Sanborn map. Now, the Sanborn was a fire insurance company from the 19th century that used to go through cities, and they would document every house on every block. Yellow houses were wood framed, pink houses were masonry. D is for dwelling, C is for commercial. And you can see there at the bottom, 521 East Bolton, and you see that porch, full width front porch with a number 1 on it. That means single story. It wasn't a 2-story porch. So we used that information and we looked around at some other properties on the same block, and we were able to develop our design based on those. And so when it was finished, it goes from this to the right-hand side. And what a difference. In fact, 2 of the original porch posts on the back of the house were from the front porch. So we were able to move them back to the front porch, and the one at the far left is a new one, milled to match the originals. And the inside, nowadays, we also stipulate certain restrictions on the inside. So this house had been divided up early on into a duplex, but it was originally a single family home. So when you walked into it back in 2016, you immediately walked straight into another door. And that door opened up into a tiny, dark, cramped staircase. But that's not how it was originally built. Originally, it had a big open side hall and an open staircase. So one of the restrictions we put on the buyer was you have to restore it back to its original floor plan. That's something that we can stipulate. It's another great thing about HSF buying the house. MPC and the local city ordinance does not have any bearing on the inside of a property. You could gut a house, tear out all the original features, but HSF, when we buy a house and sell it, we place restrictions on the interior as well. And so they were able to open up the staircase. You have this nice open light staircase again, and they used the balusters from up above on the landing. That design was used to carry it all the way down the stairs. So I'm gonna stop there because, like I said, I could go on and on, but I would like to take some of your questions. So thank you for your attention, and be happy to chat some more with you about questions.
Ryan, we own about 410 buildings, is that right?
Well, we hold easements on
hold
400.
easements, sorry, that's what I meant.
Yes, over 410. So every summer, to make sure those buildings are being properly maintained, we usually send out a team of interns to document them all and make sure that they're being properly maintained, that there's no inappropriate changes have been made, or that the building isn't deteriorating. And sometimes that's happened. Sometimes we've saved a building and sold it, but every time the property sells, the easement goes with the property. And so most of the easements we hold are in perpetuity. So, it doesn't matter if that property has had 3 or 4 different owners since the easement was granted. They're still responsible to maintain the house to our standard. And sometimes we have to go back and save a house a second time because subsequent owners over the last 30, 40 years maybe haven't kept it up. And so that can be challenging, staying on top of that.
I also want to add that, there are other preservation foundations in other cities, and Savannah's they have revolving funds, and Savannah's revolving fund is one of the most respected around the country. So just
if I can, am I off of mute? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I don't have a question right now, but this has been fascinating. I would actually like to continue to see what's more on the slides.
All right, sure. We can go through a few more. So recently we also worked on a property on the west side of Savannah. Yes. MLK, right on the border of Cuyler, Brownville. You might all remember in the news a few years ago, they started talking about building a new city precinct, a mid-city precinct for the police department. And they were looking at various vacant lots in which to build it on the west side. Unfortunately, they chose a dense block of historic workers' cottages, referred to as Meldrum Row, because they were built in the 1890s by then Mayor and Judge Peter Meldrum, for the African American community. After the Civil War, as more and more African Americans came in from the rural parts of the state into the bigger cities, there was a housing crisis. And Meldrum, who was more on the progressive side for someone of his era, decided that there needed to be adequate public housing. And so he had large sections of housing built. Unfortunately, in 2013, this block of houses was in between two historic districts that for whatever reason weren't contiguous. There was this slice of no man's land between the two districts, which meant there was no protection on them. So the city, in their infinite wisdom, decided to put the mid-city precinct right here on this block of historic affordable housing. So HSF approached them and said, you know, we've looked at the site plan. We don't agree with this, but if you're going to tear these down, can you at least save the two-story structure on the corner, which we called the caretaker's cottage? And so they proceeded with the demolition, but they left the caretaker's cottage. This road was closed and turned into the parking area. The precinct was built on the left-hand side of the screen. But we, partnered with the city, and we pledged $50,000 to the exterior restoration of the building. And the building has been retained by the city, and they've turned it into affordable housing for police officers. So there are 2 police officers who live in this house now. One of them, prior to moving in, commuted 3 hours round trip to Savannah every day to his job, and now lives across the street. And the rent is supplemented by the city in return for certain duties at the precinct. And so we were able to at least save the corner anchor property of this block. I would have liked to have seen at least one more row of those houses preserved, but and this,
It's a win-win. Let me just also say it's a win-win for the neighborhood because they have police officers living in their neighborhood. So it's a community big deal also. Really, Ryan, the open house was only a few months ago, right?
Yeah, last fall they finished it.
Yeah,
and they moved in. This was a property that we purchased back in 2018. It like some of the other properties I've mentioned, was vacant for a while. The owner had died. He was not married. He had no children. His next of kin was a nephew who sometimes took care of the property, but there was no one really to step up. And this house was just languishing, empty. And so HSF found him, and we worked with him. He agreed to become the administrator for the estate, and we paid for the probate. And there was also an outstanding loan on the property that we had to settle. And eventually we purchased the house after a year. Understand that some of these properties take a year for us to even shake loose. 2 months after we purchased the property, which at the time looked like this. This is the inside. There's the nephew there. He worked for the city in sanitation, thus the reflective vest. This is the condition of the property when we first saw it. This is the staircase leading up to the second floor. You can see people had already broken in and salvaged parts of the staircase. The mantles were all gone. But 2 months after we purchased this property, it was burned in a fire. We believe homeless people living under the back porch either deliberately or accidentally set a fire, which raged up the back porches into the attic and through the house. So we were devastated after so much work. And initially, it took off the entire roof. Initially, we thought that this was a done deal, that the house was going to have to come down. When you walked into the house, even a week after the fire, the smell in your nostrils and the water dripping in the house still. We thought and I'm often referred to as the patron saint of lost causes. And even I was just baffled as to how we could save it. But luckily, this was the parlor before. After, we weren't really sure if we could save it, but we did one crucial thing. Instead of hiring a demolition crew to just knock the thing down, we hired a deconstruction crew. We hired a nonprofit called Repurpose Savannah to come in and board by board, piece by piece, take the building apart so that we could save as much of the woodwork as possible. Now, as they did that, as they pulled off burned plaster and they shoveled out all of the garbage, the burned garbage, we realized that the core of the house was actually in far better condition structurally than we even could have hoped. And I went to the city and I said, look, is there enough of this structure left that we could possibly rehab it and sell it? And they said there was, actually, that they would consider to rehab. So we sold it to Vintage Home Restoration. Michael Condon there and his 2 kids run the business. And they are going to actually restore that house. They've already submitted plans for rebuilding the entire roof. They're going to dry it out, and it will be restored historically as it originally would have appeared. So, talk about, a phoenix. And I'm telling you, only HSF would have saved that house. Anyone after that fire, any other owner would have just had it torn down. And I think that really shows, illustrates HSF's dedication to saving historic buildings. But it also shows that we see past the worst damage to the endless potential that all of these buildings have. You've got to have a certain amount of imagination when it comes to saving these buildings, and we're absolutely dedicated to it. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
It was really good.
I actually have a question.
Yes.
The drawings that go along with the houses, that were like the prerequisites, how strict is it keeping it? Like, does paint color, exact things like,
Right.
I could imagine, right? Like somebody wants to put their own twist on it. How flexible is that?
Right. Yeah, great question. So in the case, let's take this house, for instance. So this is all based on physical documentation. Most of the porch from the handrail up was actually still intact. If you remove that lattice work, most of the original porch was still there, including those turned porch posts. We know that below it, the cinder block is obviously not original, but we know that because the top was so decorative, we felt very strongly that the bottom would have had turned balusters. Likewise, the house doesn't have any shutters on it in this picture, but we can see the hinges are still attached to the window frames where the shutters would have gone. The front doors are in keeping with Victorian style. Those doors weren't there. Some of it was based on what was next door, because there was a twin house. We know that you can see in this shot, the chimney was removed years ago. The Sanborn maps that I shared with you show that it originally had a tin roof. So we use all of that research to come up with these drawings. And so we as far as the exterior goes, we are pretty strict on the restoration looking like this. Maybe there was some variation on the doors that he installed, but they are single light Victorian style doors. We found an appropriate turned baluster to go in between the handrails. So there's some flexibility, but we're by the time we sell the property, we know pretty much what it looks like. Now, I will say that in the case of Price Street, you might have noticed when we did the drawings, we have rounded columns on the drawings. Well, when the new owner got it and started doing a little bit more research, he came back to us and he said, you know what, Ryan, I really feel strongly that the porch posts on the upper balcony, see those thin wood chamfered posts? He said, I really think those are original. On the bottom of the balcony, on the bottom porch, those are metal pipes. Those obviously weren't original. But he felt very strongly that the upper porch posts were original. And so the finished product has square chamfered posts. So that was a change that we allowed because we felt that he made a good enough case. It differed from what we had designed, but for the most part, we thought it was accurate. So we will be flexible if the person can come up with a justifiable reason why it should deviate from our plan. Does that make sense?
And Ryan works the whole time with the buyer as they go through the whole process. There's like things in place where Ryan's checking in with them. There's a certain timeline that we hope that the buyer will adhere to. The other good thing about it coming to HSF is, we also save the stories. So as Ryan's just regaled you this afternoon with stories, that's also part of our mission, saving the history and the stories of these buildings, not just the building itself, which is really, again, if HSF didn't buy the building, you wouldn't necessarily have kept the history and the story.
And there's a lot of people who, buy old homes in Savannah and fix them up. Obviously the lion's share of restoration going on in Savannah right now is all done by private investment, not by us. But the thing about when HSF gets a property is it's going to be done to the highest preservation standard. We want to preserve as much of the property inside and out. Just because someone buys a property and doesn't tear it down doesn't always mean that it's best for the house. Sometimes they will gut them. Sometimes they will do insensitive things to the house to make them more marketable or to make them more trendy. Open concept plans, tearing walls down, ripping out historic mantles. Or other times taking a single family home and chopping it up into a duplex. So we really feel that when HSF gets a house, not only is it going to be saved, but it's going to be done properly. And there are many people out there who do a great job. Believe me, we have our annual preservation awards every year in which we bestow awards upon people who do it right. It's a competitive process and we recognize the best in preservation. And there's a lot of people out there who do it right. But there's a lot of people out there also who are coming down to Savannah from the northern market, and it's a great place to park your money. And oftentimes it's sometimes they sacrifice quite a bit of integrity in an effort to, I guess, profit off of Savannah's hot market.
You mentioned interns. Does SCAD have a historic preservation major?
Mhm.
They do. They have a major and a undergraduate and master's program. In fact, SCAD's preservation department, of which I'm a graduate, master's degree. They were one of the first preservation programs in the country. SCAD started in 1978, and by 1980, they had a historic preservation program, and is one of the most respected in the country. Up there with Penn and Cornell, which are two that come to mind, Columbia. It's a great program. And yes, that is often where we get our interns, also Savannah Tech or Savannah State, but most of the time from SCAD. We always like working with the interns. It gives them some real life hands-on experience. We couldn't do it without them, frankly.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was so fascinating. And like,
It
I
was.
sat myself watching, and my son came in, and he's 6, and he's like, "Wow, look at what they did to that building, mommy." It's something that anybody can appreciate the heart and the love that you guys put into what you're doing, and how
And
you're
we're doing it all the time. We're always on the lookout for the next property that is in danger or falling in or up for demolition. And so yeah, we keep fighting the good fight.
Do you provide like a before and after driving tour that people can see?
We have in the past. That's a great question. We don't not generally, no, but I mean we have developed one. We have given it in the past to other groups, and Sue, that might be something we consider, in the future, some kind of a bus tour or something. We've done it before. Sue, I think your volume's off.
How's that?
There you
Am
go.
I on? Okay, sorry, guys. We also, for people who have preserved their home, even if it isn't ours, we have a plaque program. And one of the things I'm working with Old Town Trolley on is just around downtown, you may see an oval plaque on a building, and that's a building that's a historic building. And oftentimes it's a building that they've renovated to our standards or they've renovated. So we do have a robust plaque program, and Old Town Trolley is beginning to make that part of their discussion when they do their tours. Pre-COVID-19. So, although they're back up, I've seen some of their tour buses downtown again. So I think they're beginning to unshelter. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving us your time today.
Thank
This
you.
was delightful. We really appreciate it.
Very
Yeah.
pretty.
Everyone stay safe and healthy.
Stay
Thank
safe.
you.
Thank
For
you.
those that are interested, next month, they were talking about the Davenport House. We actually, Sue and the woman from the Davenport House will be joining us to talk about the history there. So that should also be an exciting food for thought virtually to catch. So we hope you'll
Jamie
be-
Cradle is our executive director of the Davenport House.
Yeah. All right. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
thank you, everyone. Bye. Good to
Bye.
see you. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
You too.